The old farmhouse kitchen still smelled like fresh coffee when the sky caught fire. Emma Reed had been washing dishes at the sink, watching her breath fog the window in the early morning cold, when the horizon exploded into colors that had no names. Red and green lightning danced across the clouds, and then something vast and impossible descended through the burning air. Emma dropped the coffee mug. It shattered on the wooden floor, but she barely heard it. The thing coming down from the sky was bigger than any building she had ever seen. It moved without sound, without the roar of engines or the whistle of wind. Just silence, terrible and complete, as if the world itself was holding its breath. She ran outside, her bare feet slapping against the cold porch boards. The neighbors were coming out too. Old man Peters from the next farm over stood in his doorway, still holding his morning paper. The Johnson kids pointed at the sky with wide eyes and open mouths. The ship settled into the valley like a mountain made of metal. Its surface was smooth and dark, reflecting nothing. Where it touched the earth, the grass withered and turned black. Steam rose from the ground around its edges, and the air tasted like copper and burnt ozone. Then the smaller ships came. They poured from the mother ship like angry wasps from a disturbed nest. Each one was the size of a school bus, sleek and predatory, with no visible windows or weapons. They spread across the countryside in perfect formation, moving faster than any aircraft Emma had ever seen. The first one that passed over her farm flew so low that she could see her reflection in its hull. A beam of green light shot down from its belly, washing over the farmhouse, the barn, the chicken coop. Where the light touched, everything seemed to glow for a moment with an inner fire. Then the ship moved on, but Emma knew with cold certainty that it had seen everything, recorded everything, marked everything. She ran back into the house and grabbed the old hunting rifle from above the fireplace. Her grandfather had carried it in 3 wars, and her father had taught her to shoot with it when she was 12. The weapon felt solid and real in her hands, a comfort against the impossible things happening outside. The radio was already crackling with emergency broadcasts when she turned it on. Static filled most of the channels, but she caught fragments of panicked voices from stations all across the country. Cities were burning. The military was mobilizing. The president was being moved to a secure location, and everywhere, the same message: take shelter, stay hidden, wait for help. But Emma could see through her kitchen window that help was not coming anytime soon. The alien ships were everywhere now, crisscrossing the valley in methodical patterns. They moved like hunters, patient and thorough, missing nothing. One by one, the farms in the distance went dark as the green beams swept over them. She packed, quickly, food, water, warm clothes, ammunition for the rifle. Everything went into her old hiking backpack, the one she had used for camping trips before her life had become about mortgage payments and grocery shopping. As she worked, she could hear the ships getting closer. Their humming filled the air, now, a low vibration that she felt in her bones. The back door of her house opened onto a wood that stretched for miles into the mountains. Emma had grown up playing in those trees, following deer trails and secret paths that only the local kids knew. She had always thought of the forest as her backyard, a place of childhood adventures and teenage camping trips. Now it looked like salvation. She slipped out the back door just as one of the alien ships crested the hill behind her barn. The green scanning beam swept across her property, lighting up the windows of her empty house. Emma pressed herself against the trunk of an old oak tree and held her breath. The light passed within inches of her hiding spot, but somehow it did not find her. The ship hovered over her house for long minutes, its beam probing every corner of the property. Emma could feel its attention like a physical weight, pressing down on her hiding place. But the ancient oak stood firm around her, its bark rough against her back, its roots deep in the earth that had sheltered her family for generations. Finally, the ship moved on. Emma waited until she could no longer hear its humming before she dared to move. Then she set off into the deep woods, following paths that her grandfather had shown her when she was small. Behind her, smoke began to rise from the valley as the alien ships completed their work. The forest was quiet except for the sound of her footsteps on fallen leaves. No birds sang. No squirrels chattered in the branches. Even the insects seemed to have gone silent, as if all of nature was hiding from the invaders. Emma walked carefully, staying off the main trails, following the old deer paths that wound between the trees like secrets. She was not alone in the woods. As the day wore on, she began to encounter other refugees. A family with young children carrying suitcases and looking lost. An elderly couple who had abandoned their car when the roads became clogged with fleeing vehicles. A group of hunters who had been in the forest when the ships arrived and had never gone home. They moved together without speaking, understanding instinctively that noise would bring the alien hunters. They communicated in gestures and whispers, sharing water and directions. Someone had a battery-powered radio, and they gathered around it during rest stops, listening to the fragmentary reports from the outside world. The news was bad everywhere. The alien ships had struck every major city simultaneously. Governments had fallen within hours. Military bases had been destroyed before they could respond. The few remaining radio stations spoke of resistance movements forming in rural areas, but their signals were weak and full of static. As night fell, Emma and the other survivors made camp in a cave that the hunters knew about. It was hidden behind a waterfall, invisible from the air, warm and dry. They shared food and told each other their names. For the first time since morning, Emma began to believe that she might live to see another day. Outside, the alien ships continued their patrol, their lights moving across the sky like mechanical stars. But inside the cave, surrounded by the steady sound of falling water and the quiet breathing of her fellow humans, Emma felt something that surprised her. Not fear, but anger. The invaders had taken her world, her home, her life as she had known it. But they had not taken everything. They had not taken the forest that had sheltered her since childhood. They had not taken the knowledge passed down through generations of people who had learned to live with the land instead of just on it. And they had not taken the stubborn, human refusal to give up, even when giving up seemed like the only sane option. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, new challenges. But tonight, hidden in the earth like seeds waiting for spring, the survivors slept and dreamed of fighting back. The morning mist clung to the forest floor like ghostly fingers when Emma first noticed the pattern. She had been watching the alien patrol ships for 3 days now, timing their movements, mapping their routes through the valley below. What she discovered made her heart race with possibility. The ships were predictable. Every morning at exactly 7:15, the first patrol would emerge from the mothership and begin its sweep of the eastern slopes. Every hour after that, another ship would follow the same route, scanning the same areas, checking the same hiding spots. They moved like clockwork, mechanical and precise, following a program that someone had written into their navigation systems. Emma, crouched behind a fallen log, her notebook balanced on her knee, sketching the flight patterns she had observed. Beside her, Tom Bradley adjusted his binoculars for a better view of the valley. The old park ranger had found their group 2 days ago, bringing with him a lifetime of experience reading the movements of wild animals. Now he was learning to read a different kind of predator. "There," he whispered, pointing toward a ship gliding between the hills. "See how it slows down over open ground? But it speeds up over thick forest. It's not actually looking for us in the trees." Emma nodded, adding notes to her sketch. "It's looking for clearings, buildings, roads, places where people would normally gather." She watched the ship pass over a dense stand of pine trees without even slowing down. "But we're not gathering anywhere. We're scattered like seeds." The alien ships were built for conquering civilizations, not hunting individuals. Their sensors could detect large groups of people, electronic signatures, heat from engines and power plants. But a single human moving quietly through the forest, especially one who knew how to stay hidden, barely registered on their instruments. Over the past week, more survivors had found their way to the hidden camp. There was Maria Santos, a geology professor who knew every cave system in the mountains. Bobby Wright, a local teenager who could move through the forest like smoke, appearing and disappearing between the trees as if he had been born there. Ellen Murphy, a veterinarian who understood animal behavior well enough to teach the refugees how to move like deer instead of like frightened people. They learned by trial and error, watching the ships respond to different types of movement. Quick, panicked flight triggered immediate pursuit, but slow, patient movement, especially movement that followed natural paths and rhythms, seemed almost invisible to the alien sensors. "They're hunting humans," Ellen explained one evening as they gathered around a carefully shielded fire. "But they're hunting the wrong kind of humans. They expect us to act like we're still living in cities, driving cars, using cell phones, gathering in buildings. They don't know how to track people who are living like our ancestors did 1,000 years ago." Emma watched the alien lights moving across the sky and felt a growing sense of possibility. The invaders had superior technology, overwhelming firepower, ships that could cross space between the stars. But they had one crucial weakness. They thought they understood humans, and they were wrong. The next morning brought a test of their theory. A patrol ship had been following the same route for days, sweeping a section of forest where several survivor groups were known to be hiding. Emma and a small team positioned themselves along the ship's path, moving carefully into positions where they should have been easily detected. But instead of running or hiding in obvious places, they did something different. They became part of the landscape. Emma lay flat against the forest floor, covered in leaves and moss, breathing slowly and shallowly. Tom pressed himself against the trunk of a tree, remaining so still that he might have been carved from wood. Bobby simply melted into a thicket of blackberry bushes, disappearing so completely that even Emma lost sight of him. The ship approached right on schedule. Its scanning beam swept back and forth across the forest floor, probing shadows, analyzing heat signatures, searching for the telltale signs of human presence. The green light passed directly over Emma's hiding spot, lingered there for several seconds, then moved on. She had not been detected. One by one, the other survivors tested themselves against the alien hunters. They learned to move with the wind, so their scent would not carry. They discovered that certain types of clay, when rubbed on skin and clothing, helped mask their heat signatures. They found that by timing their movements to coincide with the activities of local wildlife, they could hide their footsteps and breathing patterns in the natural sounds of the forest. Most importantly, they learned patience. The aliens expected humans to behave impatiently, to make mistakes, to take risks. But the survivors were learning to think in longer time scales, to plan movements days in advance, to wait for exactly the right moment before taking action. Word began to spread to other survivor groups. Using old hiking trails and hunting paths, messengers carried information about the alien patrol patterns and the techniques that had been proven to work. The network of hidden camps grew larger and more sophisticated, connected by runners who could travel miles through the forest without leaving a trace. The aliens seemed to sense that something was changing, but they could not figure out what. Their patrols became more frequent, their scanning beams brighter and more thorough. But the survivors had already adapted to this new reality. They were no longer refugees hiding in the forest. They were becoming something else entirely. Ghosts that could move through their own homeland without being seen. Emma stood on a ridge overlooking the alien mothership and felt a fierce satisfaction. For the first time since the invasion began, she was not afraid. The invaders had the advantage of technology and numbers, but the survivors had something more important. They were fighting on their home ground, and they were finally learning how to use it. The ship below pulsed with alien lights, processing data from 1,000 patrols, analyzing sensor readings, trying to understand why their conquest was not proceeding according to plan. But there was no data that could explain what was happening. The humans were not behaving like the species the aliens had studied and prepared to defeat. They were behaving like something older and more primal, something that had learned to survive by becoming invisible. Down in the valley, another patrol ship emerged from the mothership and began its predictable route through the forest. Emma watched it go, timing its movements, adding to her growing understanding of the enemy's weaknesses. Tomorrow, that knowledge would be shared with other groups. Next week, it might help save dozens of lives. The aliens had come to Earth expecting to fight a technological civilization. Instead, they were learning to fear an ecosystem that could think plan, and fight back. And at the heart of that ecosystem, scattered like seeds throughout the ancient forests, the last free humans were remembering what they had been before they built their first city. The hunt was on. But now it was no longer clear who was hunting whom. The alien commander stood in the center of its bridge, watching the tactical display with growing confusion. 3 weeks had passed since the initial invasion, and the conquest of this planet should have been complete by now. Instead, the display showed vast areas marked in red, regions where human resistance continued despite overwhelming technological superiority. But there were no cities in these red zones, no military bases, no infrastructure of any kind. Just empty wilderness that somehow continued to produce scattered reports of human activity. Activity that disappeared the moment search teams arrived to investigate. Commander Vorth touched the display with one of its 6 manipulator arms, zooming in on a section of forested mountains where 3 patrol ships had been lost in the past week. The ships had simply vanished, their transponder signals cutting off mid-transmission. Search teams had found wreckage scattered across the forest floor, but no signs of the sophisticated weapon systems that should have been required to bring down advanced spacecraft. Status report, Vorth commanded in its native tongue, the words translated instantly by the ship's communication system. All major population centers secured, responded the tactical officer. Urban resistance eliminated. Government structures destroyed. Military installations neutralized. However, rural sectors continue to present anomalies. Vorth studied the data streaming across its screens. By every tactical measure, this world should have surrendered. The humans had no space fleet, no energy weapons, no defense against orbital bombardment. Their largest cities had fallen within hours. Their military had been swept aside like primitive warriors facing advanced technology. Yet somehow, the conquest was stalling. In the forests below, Emma Reed crouched beside a stream, carefully washing the camouflage paint from her face. The raid had been successful beyond their wildest hopes. The alien patrol ship that had been harassing their section of the mountains for 2 weeks was now scattered across a hillside in smoking pieces, brought down by tactics that would have been familiar to her great-grandfather's generation. No advanced weapons, no sophisticated technology, just patient observation, careful planning, and an understanding of terrain that the invaders simply could not match. The trap had been elegant in its simplicity. The survivors had noticed that the patrol ships always landed in the same clearing to conduct detailed scans of suspicious areas. Over several days, they had gradually modified that clearing, moving rocks, diverting a small stream, undermining the soil in key locations. When the ship settled onto what appeared to be solid ground, it had instead sunk into a carefully prepared bog, its engines flooded, its hull cracked by the pressure of mud and water. The crew had survived the crash, but they had not survived the forest. The humans had not killed them directly, there had been no need. Lost in terrain they did not understand, unable to call for help through the natural electromagnetic interference of the mountains, the aliens had simply wandered in circles until exhaustion and exposure claimed them. "We're not fighting them," Emma explained to a group of new refugees who had arrived that morning. "We're letting the land fight them for us." The survivors had learned to see their homeland through different eyes. Every hill, every stream, every stand of trees was now a potential weapon. The forest that had once been just scenery for weekend camping trips had revealed itself as a complex system of natural defenses that could be turned against invaders who did not understand its rules. They had become students of their own environment, learning lessons that their ancestors had known but that generations of city living had almost erased. How to move through thick underbrush without leaving a trail. How to find shelter in places that looked empty to outsiders. How to use weather patterns and seasonal changes to predict when and where the alien patrols would be most vulnerable. Most importantly, they had learned to think like the forest itself, in terms of patience, adaptation, and long-term survival rather than quick victories. The alien patrols were increasing their activity, but their very intensity was working against them. The more ships they sent into the mountains, the more opportunities the survivors had to study their weaknesses. Every patrol followed predictable patterns. Every landing created opportunities for sabotage. Every attempt to establish a permanent outpost in the wilderness revealed new ways for the humans to strike back. Bobby Wright had proven especially gifted at reading the alien flight patterns. The teenager could predict where ships would land hours before they arrived, allowing survivor groups to prepare elaborate traps and ambushes. His understanding of animal behavior had translated perfectly to hunting mechanical prey that followed, programmed responses instead of natural instincts. "They think like machines," he explained to Emma as they watched another patrol ship circle overhead, searching for signs of the humans who had destroyed its sister ship. "They do the same thing every time because their computers tell them it's efficient, but they don't adapt when the situation changes." The survivors, on the other hand, were adapting constantly. They had abandoned their old ways of thinking about warfare, about resistance, about what it meant to fight for their freedom. Instead of trying to match the aliens' technology, they had embraced older forms of human knowledge that had nothing to do with machines or weapons. They learned to communicate across vast distances using techniques borrowed from hunting cultures. Patterns of broken branches, carefully placed stones, smoke signals that looked like natural fires to alien sensors. They developed supply networks that moved food and medicine along paths that had been used for centuries, before roads existed. Most remarkably, they began to work with the local wildlife in ways that seemed almost magical. Birds served as an early warning system, their flight patterns changing predictably when alien ships approached. Deer trails led refugee groups to safe crossing points that avoided patrol zones. Even the weather seemed to be cooperating, providing fog and storms at exactly the moments when cover was needed most. The forest was teaching them to be something they had never been before, perfectly adapted to their environment. Not as conquerors, who dominated the landscape, but as participants in a complex system that had evolved over millions of years to protect and nurture life. Commander Vorth reviewed the latest reports from the surface with growing concern. Patrol losses were accelerating. Supply convoys were disappearing. Landing parties were failing to return from routine missions. Most disturbing of all, there was no clear enemy to fight. The humans had not massed for battle or formed conventional resistance movements. They had simply melted into their natural habitat like some kind of primitive camouflage system. The commander's tactical computers could model invasion scenarios involving nuclear weapons, energy shields, space fleets, and planetary defense networks. But they had no algorithms for dealing with an enemy that fought like a forest ecosystem, slowly, patiently, using every element of the environment as both weapon and shield. For the first time since beginning its military career, Commander Vorth felt something that its species rarely experienced: uncertainty about the outcome of a battle. The humans were not stronger than the invasion force. They were not more technologically advanced. But they were becoming something that the alien strategic models had never anticipated. They were becoming indistinguishable from the world that had created them. Down in the valleys and ridges below, Emma Reed cleaned her weapons and prepared for another night of patient hunting. The invaders had superior firepower, advanced sensors, and the ability to strike from orbit. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had tried to conquer a world without understanding what made it worth conquering in the first place. The humans were not just hiding in the forest, they were becoming the forest, and the forest was beginning to fight back. The alien supply convoy never saw the attack coming. From orbit, the route looked perfectly safe, a straight path through empty forest, avoiding all known human settlements, following terrain that offered no obvious hiding places for large groups of insurgents. The convoy's escorts had scanned the area repeatedly, finding nothing but trees, rocks, and the scattered heat signatures of native wildlife. They were completely unprepared for a forest that had learned to hunt. The first sign of trouble came when the lead transport began sinking into what appeared to be solid ground. The pilot tried to abort the landing, but the ship's engines were already clogged with a thick, sticky substance that looked like tree sap, but burned like acid. Within seconds, the transport was helplessly grounded, its hull splitting as hidden. Cables pulled it deeper into the earth. The escort ships tried to provide air support, but their targeting systems could not lock onto enemies that moved like wind through the trees. Figures appeared and disappeared between the trunks, never staying in one place long enough to be hit, never presenting clear targets that distinguished them from the natural movements of the forest itself. Emma Reed watched the destruction from her command position on a ridge overlooking the ambush site. After 2 months of preparation, the trap was working exactly as planned. The survivors had not built this ambush. They had grown it, shaping the forest itself into a weapon that the aliens could not understand or counter. The sticky sap that was destroying the transport engines came from modified maple trees that the survivors had been cultivating for weeks. The cables pulling the ships into the earth were woven from invasive vines that had been carefully trained to grow in specific patterns. Even the soft ground that had swallowed the convoy was a natural marsh that had been deepened and concealed using techniques borrowed from beaver dam construction. Phase 2, Emma whispered into her radio, using a communication system built from salvaged electronics and powered by small solar panels disguised as fallen leaves. Across the ambush zone, the survivors implemented the second part of their plan. But instead of attacking the disabled ships directly, they simply melted back into the forest and waited. The aliens would have to send rescue teams, and rescue teams would follow predictable protocols that could be exploited. This was the fundamental difference between how the aliens thought and how the survivors had learned to think. The invaders planned for single engagements, decisive battles, clear victories and defeats. The humans were learning to think in terms of ecosystems, complex, interconnected systems where every action created ripple effects that could be predicted and used. The rescue ships arrived within an hour, just as the survivors had expected. They followed standard alien tactical doctrine, establishing a secure perimeter, deploying ground teams, beginning systematic recovery operations, all of which had been anticipated and prepared for. Bobby Wright led the first harassment team. Moving through the forest with skills that seemed almost supernatural, he and his group began a campaign of psychological warfare designed to exploit the aliens' growing fear of the terrestrial environment. Equipment disappeared from supposedly secure locations. Sentries reported movement in their peripheral vision that vanished when they turned to look directly. Strange sounds echoed through the trees, human voices that seemed to come from nowhere, mimicking alien distress calls with perfect acoustic precision. The aliens began to make mistakes. Nervous sentries fired at shadows, revealing their positions and wasting ammunition. Officers made increasingly desperate radio calls for reinforcement, clogging their own communication channels. Entire squads broke formation to investigate phantom threats, leaving gaps in their defensive lines that the survivors could exploit. Maria Santos coordinated the geological phase of the operation from her position in a natural cave system that the aliens had not yet discovered. Using her knowledge of local rock formations and water tables, she had spent weeks preparing a series of controlled landslides and flash floods that could be triggered with careful precision. When the alien rescue teams moved into the valley to recover their damaged transports, they found themselves walking into a trap that had been prepared by the landscape itself. Rocks that had stood for centuries suddenly shifted and rolled. Streams that had followed the same course for generations changed direction without warning. Hillsides that looked perfectly stable revealed hidden weaknesses that could be exploited with nothing more sophisticated than a crowbar and good timing. The aliens had superior technology, but they were fighting an enemy that had become part of the environment they were trying to conquer. Every tree, every stone, every drop of water had been turned into a potential weapon, and the humans wielding these weapons moved through their transformed landscape with the confidence of predators who had finally learned to hunt in their native habitat. Commander Vorth studied the tactical reports from the failed convoy mission with growing alarm. Losses were no longer isolated incidents. They were part of a systematic campaign that seemed to be coordinated by the planet itself. His forces were being attacked by landslides, quicksand, flash floods, and equipment failures that appeared natural, but were too precisely timed to be coincidental. Most disturbing were the reports from ground teams who had survived encounters with human resistance groups. They described enemies who moved through the forest like ghosts, appearing and disappearing without warning, striking with primitive weapons that somehow proved devastatingly effective against advanced alien technology. The humans had learned to use their environment as both camouflage and weapon, turning familiar terrain into a maze of natural traps and ambush points. They no longer fought like the civilized species that the aliens had studied and prepared to conquer. They fought like the forest ecosystem itself, patient, persistent, and perfectly adapted to their environment. "Request immediate reinforcements," Vorth commanded, transmitting the message to the fleet command ship in orbit. "Human resistance is stronger than anticipated. Recommend orbital bombardment of all forested regions." But even as he sent the request, the commander knew it would not be approved. The whole point of the invasion was to claim this planet's resources, not to destroy them. Burning the forests would eliminate the human resistance, but it would also eliminate much of what made the world worth conquering. The humans seemed to understand this perfectly. They had chosen to make their stand in exactly the places that the aliens could not afford to destroy. Every attack on the resistance risked damaging the very ecosystems that the invasion was meant to capture intact. Down in the forest, Emma Reed sat by a small fire, studying maps that showed the growing network of survivor communities scattered across the mountain ranges. Each group had become specialized, adapted to their particular environment and the specific challenges it presented. Desert survivors were learning different techniques than those hiding in swamps. Coastal groups were developing tactics that worked with tides and weather patterns. Mountain communities were becoming experts at using altitude and terrain to their advantage. But they were all connected by the same basic understanding. They were no longer fighting as individual humans trying to preserve a technological civilization. They were fighting as part of a living system that had existed long before cities and would continue to exist long after the last spaceship had returned to the stars. The aliens had come to conquer a planet. Instead, they were discovering that the planet had its own immune system, and that system was learning to recognize them as a threat that needed to be eliminated. The forest around Emma's fire rustled with the movement of her people, invisible scouts and hunters who moved through, the darkness like spirits of the land itself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to strike back at the invaders. But tonight, surrounded by the ancient rhythms of the natural world, Emma allowed herself to believe that they might actually win. Not by becoming stronger than their enemies, but by becoming so completely integrated with their environment that the two could no longer be separated. The aliens could defeat humans, but they could not defeat a forest that thought and planned and fought back with every tool that millions of years of evolution had provided. The war was far from over, but the balance was beginning to shift. The alien mothership hung in the dawn sky like a dying star, its hull scarred by months of unexpected warfare. Inside its command center, Commander Vorth faced a decision that no military academy had prepared it for. How to explain to the High Command that an entire invasion fleet had been defeated by primitives armed with sticks and stones. The final reports painted a picture that defied all strategic understanding. Urban areas remained under alien control, but they were empty shells, their populations scattered to the winds. The humans had simply abandoned their cities, their technology, their entire civilization, and melted into the wilderness like water soaking into earth. What emerged from that wilderness was something the aliens had never encountered in a dozen previous conquests. A species that could become invisible by becoming indigenous. A resistance movement that fought with the patience of geological time and the adaptive power of evolution itself. Losses are unacceptable, Vorth transmitted to the fleet command ship. Human resistance has proven impossible to eliminate without destroying the planetary ecosystem. Recommend strategic withdrawal. The response came back within hours. Approved. The High Command had reviewed the casualty reports, the resource expenditure data, the complete failure to establish sustainable control over rural regions. This world was simply too expensive to conquer. But down in the forests and mountains, Emma Reed was thinking beyond victory. She stood on the ridge where she had first seen the alien ships arrive, watching them prepare to depart, and her mind was already turning to the future, that would come after the last invader had disappeared into space. The humans had won, but they had won by becoming something different. The survivors scattered across the wilderness were no longer the same species that had built cities and highways and shopping malls. They had remembered older ways of being human, ways that went deeper than technology or civilization. "What happens now?" asked Bobby Wright, joining her on the ridge. The teenager had grown up during the invasion, his childhood replaced by lessons in camouflage and guerrilla warfare. He moved through the forest like a wild creature, completely at home in an environment that would have terrified his former self. Emma smiled, watching the alien ships lift into the sky. "Now we decide what kind of world we want to rebuild." The question was more complex than it sounded. The survivors had access to all the technology they needed to recreate their former civilization. The abandoned cities contained everything required to restore power grids, communication networks, industrial systems. They could go back to being the species they had been before the invasion, living on the land instead of with it. But they also had another option. They had learned to live as part of the ecosystem that had sheltered them, to think in terms of long-term sustainability instead of short-term convenience, to see themselves not as conquerors of nature but as participants in it. Over the following months, as the alien fleet dwindled to a few points of light in the night sky, the survivors faced this choice community by community. Some groups decided to return to the cities, to rebuild the technological society that had been lost. They had learned valuable lessons about self-reliance and environmental awareness that would make their new civilization stronger and more sustainable. But others chose to remain in the wilderness, to continue developing the way of life that had saved them during the invasion. They built new kinds of settlements, communities that worked with natural systems instead of dominating them, technologies that enhanced human capability without destroying the environment that sustained it. Emma found herself part of a third group, people who moved between the rebuilding cities and the forest communities, serving as bridges between two different visions of humanity's future. They carried knowledge back and forth, ensuring that neither path would lose the wisdom that had been gained during the dark months of the invasion. The cities that rose from the ruins were different from their predecessors. Their architecture followed natural patterns, their energy systems mimicked biological processes, their transportation networks moved like rivers through landscapes that remained largely wild. The humans who lived in them had not forgotten the lessons of the forest, and in the wilderness, the forest communities developed their own unique cultures, combining ancient human wisdom with insights gained from their struggle for survival. They became guardians of knowledge that the species would need if it ever again faced existential threats that could not be defeated with conventional weapons. Children born after the invasion grew up with stories of the time when the sky burned and the forest fought back. They learned to move quietly through wild places, to read the subtle signs of weather and season, to understand that human survival depended not on conquering their environment, but on becoming part of it. These children would grow up to be explorers, and scientists, artists, and engineers. But they would also be something more. Humans who understood that their species' greatest strength was not its technology, but its ability to adapt, to learn, to become whatever the world needed them to be. Years later, when the first human ships left Earth to explore other worlds, they carried both kinds of knowledge with them. They brought the tools and techniques needed to build new civilizations among the stars, but they also brought the wisdom to live lightly on alien landscapes, to work with extraterrestrial ecosystems instead of against them. And when they inevitably encountered other species, other civilizations, they approached them with the patience and humility that the forest had taught them. They had learned that true strength came not from dominating others, but from finding ways to coexist, to adapt, to become part of something larger than themselves. The invasion that was meant to destroy humanity had instead transformed it. The aliens had come expecting to find a species trapped by its own technology, limited by its dependence on artificial systems. Instead, they had awakened something older and more adaptable, something that had been sleeping beneath the surface of human civilization for generations. Emma stood in her garden 30 years after the invasion, her hair now silver, her hands weathered by decades of working with soil and stone. Around her, The settlement she had helped to found thrived in harmony with the forest that surrounded it. Children played in streams that ran clean. Adults worked in fields that fed the community without depleting the land. Elders taught skills that would be passed down to generations yet unborn. The alien ships were long gone, but their memory remained as a reminder of what humanity could become when it remembered its deepest roots. They had tried to conquer a planet and had instead given its inhabitants the greatest gift imaginable, the knowledge that they could survive anything by becoming part of everything. In the distance, a ship lifted from the spaceport that had been built where the old city once stood. It carried humans to the stars, but these were humans who knew that home was not a place you conquered, but a relationship you cultivated. They would plant new forests among alien suns, build new communities that grew like gardens, and remember always that their greatest strength lay not in standing apart from the worlds they explored, but in learning to belong to them. The forest whispered around Emma's garden, carrying the scent of growing things and the promise of seasons yet to come. Somewhere in that whisper was the echo of all the humans who had chosen to trust the land that raised them, who had found their way home by refusing to surrender it to invaders who could never understand what made it worth defending. The seeds they had planted during those dark months were still growing, would always be growing, taking root in soil that remembered how to shelter its children when they learned to shelter it in return. And in that endless cycle of growth and protection, humanity had found something more valuable than any technology: the knowledge that they were not separate from the world that made them, but part of it, forever and always, like trees in an ancient forest that would endure long after the last spaceship had faded into the depths of space. The invasion was over. The real victory was just beginning.